Good morning and welcome to the 30th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2019. Apologies have been received from committee member Andy Whiteman. May I ask all those in the public gallery to turn any devices they have to silent, please. Item 1 on the agenda is a decision by the committee to take items 3 and 4 in private. Are we agreed? Thank you. We now turn to our consideration of the Consumer Scotland Bill. And for this today we have in our first panel 3 witnesses. First of all, Fiona Richardson, who is the Chief Officer at Trading Standards Scotland, Andrew Bartlett, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Advice Direct Scotland Limited, and Graham Payton, who is the Vice Chair of the Society of Chief Officers of Trading Standards in Scotland. So welcome to all 3 of you. And if I might start by asking you a question about the recent challenges and what changes you may have witnessed in the trading standards environment following the various reviews that have taken place in Scotland and the UK. What are the current challenges, and have these been identified in recent reviews? Who would like to, if you just indicate when you want to speak by raising your hand, and you don't need to press any buttons, that will be dealt with by the sound desk. So Graham Payton.
Thank you. I think the various reviews that have taken place over the past few years, be it the Audit Scotland Review of 2013, even going back to the Audit Scotland Review back in 2003, they've all identified that the trend in trading standards in Scotland with regard to resourcing and numbers and capacity has been in steady decline. And until that's addressed, we won't have the capacity on the ground to deal with the evolving issues, or even the issues that we're dealing with at the moment. But the evolving issues, we simply won't have the capacity to deal with them. And I note that Scots and the wider trading standards profession would very much like to play a role in the Consumer Scotland body. But as our numbers decline and our resources decline, it may be more difficult for us to play a leading role in that. The leading role we would prefer to play, it may be more difficult for us to play that role going forward.
Can you give us just what the general figures or numbers are on the decline you refer to?
Well, in the latest Scots workforce survey, the numbers of officers in trading standards across Scotland have dropped from 500 in 2002 to 250 this year. So that's a drop of half of our capacity in the last 15 years, 16 years.
And your point is that without people to actually enforce things, the standards are meaningless, is that right?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that last part.
Would you say that having standards or rules, if there's no one to actually ensure they're enforced, are meaningless?
Meaningless is a bit dramatic, but yes, I suppose it is. If you can have all the laws you want, but if you've got no one to enforce them, then who's going to adhere to them?
I suppose meaningless, you're right, is perhaps too dramatic, because people will voluntarily follow standards, but then there are those who won't, and that's really what enforcement is about for the people who...
From the illicit trade aspect right up to those who you would think would hold standards high, there is a tendency at the higher end to sort of, well, we're not really getting followed, so we'll maybe not just follow the rules as assiduously as we might. I mean, you look at the VW scandals, you look at the emission scandals in America, where you'd think that these companies would be absolutely on the ball, whereas they are partial to a slight move away from the ethical, if they're not being pursued.
I think Fiona Richardson, you wanted to come in for comment.
Yes, thank you. My team's the National Trading Standards team, which is funded by the UK government and was set up as a result of the landscape reviews in 2012. We were put in place with the intention of adding capacity to local authority trading standard services, particularly taking on cross-border and national consumer enforcement cases. We've also worked to establish an intelligence database for use of trading standard services across Scotland, allowing resources to be better targeted. But having done all that work, we still do rely on there being officers at a local authority level to discover the issues that are there, which can then be referred up to our team as well for more serious cases.
Would you say that your services offset to a certain extent the decline in numbers that we've heard about at local level?
So my team is 23, 24 staff. And they're not included in the workforce survey. However, because of the nature of the work that we do, not all of my staff are drawn from a trading standards background. Some of them are other ex-law enforcement agencies. So we've got ex-police officers, ex-fraud investigators from a number of bodies that work with it, as well as trading standards staff. So whilst we have a small number of what would be called trading standards staff, it's maybe 6 or 7.
Are those dedicated to Scotland?
Yes.
Yes, all right. Andrew Bartlett, did you want to comment on any of this?
Well, from our perspective, obviously we need to manage the expectations of our consumers who come through. All the trading standards in Scotland can share their protocols with us in real time. We do try to not overpromise if there's a specific area where we know that a trading standards officer will not be attending the premises, etc. And obviously we would always welcome more people on the front line.
All right, we'll turn now to questions from the Deputy Convener.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning. We know that Consumer Scotland, when it's established, will inevitably there'll be an expectation of information and intelligence sharing across the way and up the way and so on. Andrew, this question is really specifically for you. How does your relationship work with trading standards? How does that give us a flavour of that information and sharing model and how you perhaps see it working when Consumer Scotland's established?
We share any relevant case with both the trading standards of the area where the consumer lives and where the trader is based. If it's something where their protocol tells us that they will take action on, we will share the individual's sensitive personal information at this point so that they can then carry out enforcement action if they see fit. But we also send intelligence. So we send information that says, you know, we've had people in your area complaining about, you know, maybe some doorstop selling, but they didn't want to be specific. They didn't want to put themselves out in front. We share information with Trading Standards Scotland, so we very much changed the information we gather to try and give these guys the tools that they need to actually deliver a service. So, for example, we now will collect a registration number of a vehicle if someone is concerned about a doorstop seller, because a vehicle registration number is far harder to change than a mobile phone number, for example. So what we're trying to do is gather information that is useful on a practical and an enforcement level.
Do you see that kind of relationship being mirrored when Consumer Scotland is established? And do you see any difficulties in the data sharing aspect to this?
We already share data in real time with the Scottish Government. So they've got a headline view at all times of where we are. We're very keen on supporting trading standards, both local authority trading standards and Trading Standards Scotland, according to their current programmes. So we're just about to launch a programme along with SSPCA, the British Veterinary Association, the Dogs Trust and the Chief Vet for Scottish Government around puppy farms, where we're going to give a landing page to vets where they don't have to interrupt their busy day to make a phone call, etc. Well, hopefully we can gather some intelligence that will actually help Trading Standards stamp this trade out.
There was some discussion at previous evidence sessions about perhaps being the need for legislative changes in relation to data sharing at a UK level. Is that something that you might want to, Fiona, you've got?
So there are some restrictions on how certain bodies can share information that they find through their enforcement work, which are put in place under the Enterprise Act. Across the UK, and under Part 9 of that, there are some restrictions as to how enforcement information can be shared. But in general terms of sharing high-level data, that, you know, as long as it's anonymised and it doesn't relate to a particular trader and it's more about a business practice or a sector, then that would be fine. But from our point of view, it would be of assistance if Consumer Scotland were a recognised body under the Enterprise Act to enable that further.
Okay, thanks for that. Thank you.
Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I understand there's been some discussion re Consumer Scotland having formal involvement in trade and standard services regarding consumer and competition issues. What are the panel's views on that, and do you have any insight as to why this hasn't been taken up in the bill?
So I'll go first because everybody else has been quiet. Obviously enforcement's reserved to the UK government, so it would be out with the Scottish Government's powers to provide formal oversight of the enforcement provision in Scotland. I don't think it's necessarily a deal breaker for Consumer Scotland that they don't have that power. I think from the other side of the coin, what trading standards locally certainly are looking for is further support in terms of funding and resource to enable them to continue as an effective service. But that's a slightly different thing than Consumer Scotland providing oversight and direction to trading standards.
Previously been a councillor, Mr Payton, can you advise me how this bill would actually affect you or your officers?
It might, the bill itself might help us with regards to developing a fuller picture of consumer detriment in Scotland from the various disparate sources of consumer advice that consumers will use to help them resolve their issues. They don't always come to ADS, they don't always come to trading standards, they may go to Resolve, or they may go to CAB, they may go to CS. If there was a fuller picture and that there was an ability to redirect consumers to the correct body to deal with their complaint, that might help us get the full picture and be able to say, well, look, you know, we've got one complaint, but Resolver have got 3, and we can put those together and we can make a difference for consumers. The lack of an enforcement duty, I don't think is. The concern is that if Consumer Scotland did have an enforcement duty, but that there may be a clash between the requirements or the demands of Westminster and Holyrood, because we've got 2 different legislative bodies telling us that they want us to do things, and if there is a clash, then that causes us issues, because which do we follow?
The best one.
The loudest one.
Thanks for that. Thank you.
Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm just wondering, Graham Patton, you said you've got a lack of resources at the moment. You've seen numbers cut by about half in 15 years. Funding comes from local authorities. Is that correct? So where do you see the funding picture over the next 2, 3, 5 years?
Well, my other hat is Trading Standards Manager for Aberdeen City Council, and the picture so far has been a slow. We face cuts year on year, and there's no getting away from that. The austerity picture is still there, and at the moment, speaking as a TS manager, I'm trying to juggle between recruiting somebody but still being able to provide the savings that are required to balance the budget. So that's not going to improve. There's not going to be any drastic improvement in the picture in the next few years, as far as I can tell, and that's even in the face of additional resources being provided by the Scottish Government to local authority trading standard services to deal with tobacco and NVP, where we have where additional funding was provided by the Scottish Government. We were able to recruit officers, and now we do a lot of business advice and enforcement work in that area. So even despite those additional resources, we are still facing reductions.
And are there currently cases that are not being investigated, or investigated as fully as you'd like them to be, or taken as forward because of those restrictions?
Well, we work on a risk basis, so if there are investigations that need to be done, those are done. certainly within my authority, they are done, and other things are not. Simply put.
So would you expect with the new body, an increase in perhaps if there's more of awareness of consumer issues and areas where obviously you can perhaps enforce where they can't, would you expect your workload to increase, and what would you need to be able to accommodate that?
Well, in order to know what, it's a case of supply and demand, isn't it, really? We would have to know what kind of additional demands were being placed on us in order to respond to them. But certainly if the complete picture produces more complaints for us to look into, or more intelligence for us to act upon, then clearly we would have to have additional resources and additional staff in order to meet that demand.
Have you had any discussions with either government or local government, Scottish Government or local government representatives in terms of what that potential, whether there would be potentially more resource available?
Well, we're currently, although I'm not part of those discussions at the moment, colleagues within Scots are in discussion with COSLA on a workforce review, and with a view to getting more trainees in at the ground level, while we still have the capacity to train them, so that we can reinforce our services moving forward. I believe there's also been discussions with Scottish Government on that regard, and although they haven't said no, they haven't said yes, they haven't said no either. So we're still quite positive in that.
All right, thank you.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Madam. I'd like to look at some of the powers and so on round about Consumer Scotland, and the bill gives Consumer Scotland advice, advocacy, research and information gathering powers. Are these the right mix of powers? Should there be anything else added to that?
In essence, the powers are lifted from the UK legislation, which is the Consumers Estate Agents and Redress Act, which provided powers to advocacy bodies, and so they've just lifted those powers for advocacy bodies and put them into Scottish legislation. So that they should be enough to make it a strong consumer advocate, which is obviously what the body is initially intended to be on reading of the bill. Part of the issue with the bill is obviously it's very much enabling legislation, so I can see it's been given powers to be an advocate, but not entirely how it's going to deliver that.
Do you think that the powers are adequate for its purpose?
To be an advocacy body, yes.
Is there anything that could usefully be added to it?
Certainly in our submission when we went back, we would have liked to have seen the body act as a quality assurance body for provision of consumer advice. We thought that would have been a worthwhile thing for the body to do. Obviously there's a lot of different consumer advice provision in a lot of different sectors across the country, and it would be good to see that those were delivered to a particular standard and that was monitored and measured.
Who's responsible for quality assurance at the moment?
Nobody.
Nobody?
There might be, in certain sectors, there'll be oversight, but not a general oversight of the whole provision.
Okay.
Just to be clear, from our perspective, we have a quality management system. We're ISO 9001 accredited. Our data is all protected under ISO 27001. We have a compliance team. Our frontline staff do peer reviews, so Fiona would have a look at some of Graham's work, and Graham will have a look at some of Fiona's work just to make sure we're at a level. We have levelling sessions. We take feedback from all the organisations that we send referrals to. So, for example, if one of Graham's team felt that the information we'd supplied was not correct, or there was an error in the advice that was given, we absolutely take that, feed that back and learn from it. So quality never stops.
So, Jim.
Yeah. Well, local authorities, trading standards services used to participate in a quality assurance system, but that was voluntary, and it kind of fell into abeyance quite a few years ago. I think Scots have discussed trying to bring it back, but with all the other competing demands in our time, we simply haven't had time to address it. Going back to your original question, if I may, one of the other things that would have been beneficial, I think, would have been consumer advocacy and would have been consumer redress. I think it sits alongside consumer advice and consumer advocacy very well, and certainly on for dealing with complaints, being able to bring ADR to the table would have been advice, alternative dispute resolution under our redress system would have been beneficial, I think.
Redress kind of implies some form of enforcement, which of course this consumer body doesn't have. Should it have? Should it have an element of enforcement? Could it? Given that enforcement as such is
it doesn't.
still reserved.
It could include a degree of enforcement, but the advice dispute resolution we're thinking about is more mediation rather than enforcement. Certainly, as a trading standards officer, I have dealt with and mediated in consumer complaints with traders many times to try and avoid the need for that consumer to pursue their rights by raising a small claim or taking it further. So that's the kind of dispute resolution that I have in mind.
Alternative dispute resolution, should that be included in the bill? I mean, it's not there at the moment. Should it be included in the bill, or should it be left to Consumer Scotland to decide to develop that?
Well, the question is whether it's been devolved rather than whether it should be there. I believe it's one of the 4 pillars that wasn't devolved, the other being enforcement. So it might be that if Consumer Scotland gets established and realises that is something that it needs to fully discharge its duties under consumer advice and redress, perhaps it needs to approach the UK government to see whether that can be devolved as well.
Do the other panel members have any comment on that?
Yeah, I believe the view is that it hasn't been devolved, and that, as such, the Scottish Government wouldn't have the powers to look at it. Certainly, the UK Government are looking at alternative dispute resolution as they're pulling together their white paper on consumers, but unfortunately that white paper was supposed to have been published in the summer and is now obviously we don't have a publication date for it at the moment, given the current status of the UK Government. And it would have made some direction about alternate dispute resolution. And there's no reason why the UK Government could not give powers to Consumer Scotland in the future to look at doing that. And that might be an appropriate route.
At the moment, it is not a devolved power.
No.
Okay. Consumer Scotland's going to have the powers to commission advice. How do you think it should use these powers?
I think in terms of advice, we really need to look at practical advice, you know, not just the quantitative, we've spoken to X number of people, actually understanding what the underlying issues are and what practical routes consumers can actually follow. Not everything will end up at the door of trading standards. We currently give people fully completed letters which they can email to a trader that they're in dispute with, rather than pointing people at templates, and that's been very successful. We are trying to provide far better self-help journeys, so people who can help themselves can help themselves. And I think the answer, unfortunately, is that people will seek advice where they choose to seek advice. But at the moment, we are the only organisation that is directly commissioned by the Scottish Government to provide an advice service, per se. So we're very much trying to give people practical, actionable advice, rather than saying you've got rights but not giving you any information as to how you might exercise them. And just if I make back to your previous point, we will try and link people with an alternative dispute resolution provider where appropriate, not just for the sake of doing it, but if we know that it's an organisation that gets results, we will absolutely look to connect our consumers with an ADR provider.
Consumer Scotland has the power to both provide and commission advice. How is that going to fit in?
To our model?
Yes.
Well, we would obviously hope to still be one of the organisations that was providing advice, but I think unfortunately, or fortunately, in the modern era, there can no longer be a single gateway to advice, because the internet is taken that idea and and run away with it. So we have to accept that there will be multiple providers. They will not all come from the third sector. So we're a charity, we're a non-profit. There will be organisations from the for-profit sector. We will see all sorts of different ADR appear over time. But we also have to be wary. So, for example, on the very same day that the Thomas Cook refund scheme went live, the best-looking site was actually a fraud. So, again, we have to be, make sure our consumers are aware of where they should go.
Okay. Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Convener. The Bill's provision states that it must use its powers in a collaborative way, but we've also heard that there are concerns about duplication of activities. How do you see it meeting the provision without duplicating its activities with other consumer organisations?
So in terms of
advocacy, advice,
yeah,
research, the whole gamut.
I think inevitably consumers will go for advice where consumers see fit. So they will go to an organisation that they've either found online, somebody's recommended to them, that the Scottish Government have recommended. In terms of duplication, it is very clear. So, for example, if we look at face-to-face organisations, they give great face-to-face services, and we should not think that we can simply displace those face-to-face services with an online-only offering. So we need to understand that there is valuable intelligence within the face-to-face piece. But primarily, face-to-face agencies tend to be by the community, for the community, in the community, and consumer will be an issue rather than the driving issue. Our consumeradvice.scot, we are just there for consumers. That's what we do. There are other parts to our business which I don't propose to touch on today unless the committee particularly want me to, but our consumeradvice.scot is there to give practical, actionable, relevant consumer advice and information on the channel of the customer's choosing. So if somebody wants to come to us on web chat, we should deal with them on web chat. If they want to phone us, they should phone us. I think the important thing, though, is it has to be absolutely free at the point of use. I think that's a key message.
Yeah.
I suppose from our point of view, we do have some concern that a new body could duplicate work that's already been done by other people in the landscape, and possibly disrupt some of those partnerships and relationships that are already there. But the other side of that is we think that if with a sort of strong central body, if it can bring those people together and build an effective collaborative network based on shared data, then there's a real benefit to be gained for everybody from that. And I suppose the proof will be in the pudding as when the body sets up and how it goes about building those relationships. And obviously, bringing a new body into a landscape like this, there will be some territorial concerns from people that are already there. But I think what we have to look at is where things can be improved, and where things can be improved at the moment is that gathering and collating and analysis of data that's held across different areas.
I'm noticing that Section 6.3 of the bill imposes a duty on Consumer Scotland to work in cooperation with other consumer organisations. So does that not allay some of the concern that you have in that area?
Hope that would do that, yes, and that we will build that. I mean, certainly what we would like to see at the moment at UK level, we've got the Consumer Protection Partnership, which brings together a variety of different bodies, and we've always advocated strongly that we'd like to see something similar in Scotland. But what I would like to see in Scotland is something that actually is more formalised in terms of the roles and responsibilities of the different partners and what they should contribute to that network and what work they should take on as a result of being a part of it.
Okay. And in terms of Section 13 of the bill, what we're understanding is that this new organisation, in terms of research, will maybe look at 2 or 3 subjects a year, but they're going to publish in advance their work programme. How helpful is that to the wider consumer protection advice sector, that they're going to publish their work programme in advance?
Published work programme in advance is good. We can obviously see where they're going to be working. I think the ability to have a body that can conduct that high-level research is going to be very welcome, and to have that future look. One of the problems we've always had in enforcement is that by the time we've discovered where the the new problem is. It's too late, it's already well established, and it can be difficult for us to tackle. So being able to identify those interventions earlier would be very helpful.
Anybody else want to come in there? No. Right.
Just quickly on that, we would welcome it in advance view, but also to understand what information Consumer Scotland felt would assist them, and so we can then actually try and get the intelligence rather than at the end saying it would have been good if we'd had this. We can collect that very easily.
Effectively, everybody can have a bit of a focus on what the subjects are for that year and assist the organisation.
Very much.
Yeah. So moving on to my other point, we've touched upon a wee bit about information gathering, that the new organisation is going to have the powers to gather data from a range of organisations in order to understand business models or markets. What's your view about whether the powers they've got are sufficient for this task? Yeah.
I understand from our discussions with the Scottish Government that those powers won't include the ability to request information from local authorities. So that seems to me to be a bit of a loss, considering the amount of information that we hold, because our information doesn't just come from Andrew's ADS system. We gather information from businesses, from various other sources to build up a bigger picture. So there is a great deal of information here by local authorities which might be beneficial, which you won't get from any other source. So that would seem to be, local authorities would want to cooperate with CS at every level, and that seems to me to be a bit of a, if that duty was there, then perhaps it would make it easier for us.
Would there be any data sharing issues relating to that?
Well, only those that have previously been identified with Fiona under Part 9 of the Enterprise Act.
Okay. Anybody else want to come in now?
Just from our perspective, we think that the more data that can be shared, the more effective the outcomes, and the more focused Consumer Scotland can be.
Okay, thanks very much.
Richard Lyle, did you have further questions on another area? No.
Basically, Consumer Scotland is expected to be evidence-led. This will require voluntary information sharing from a variety of organisations active in consumer issues. So how does information sharing arrangements between Trade and Standard Services and Advice Direct Scotland work at this moment in time?
We have a portal, and we share information as appropriate with both local authority trading standards and Trading Standards Scotland. Obviously, this is all done with informed consent from our consumers, which they can withhold.
So do you foresee any barriers for sharing trading standards information with Consumer Scotland?
I think the barrier is sharing people's sensitive personal information. If we are sharing anonymised data, I don't think there's any barrier at all. And in my view, and it is my view, is that this should be a relatively straightforward task.
Okay. And how can it maintain a focus on issues affecting vulnerable consumers? How can you maintain a focus on issues affecting vulnerable consumers?
So actually, I don't particularly like the bit in the bill in relation to vulnerable consumers, because I feel it's actually slightly restrictive and potentially a slightly old-fashioned way of looking at what we would now perhaps more commonly describe as consumer vulnerability, which can change. I can be vulnerable at particular points when being a consumer, but other points I am very well informed and should be and empowered, but depending on my circumstances at the time, then that could make me vulnerable. So I actually think the provisions in the bill relating to vulnerable consumers or consumer vulnerability perhaps don't give the body the strongest place they need to be in to look at those areas, because that is not a simple case of just saying old people are more vulnerable than other people. And as a number of submissions have noted, there's no mention of young consumers and their particular vulnerabilities either. So there's no doubt that Consumer Scotland should focus their attention on vulnerabilities, but I don't think the bill is particularly well drafted to enable them to do that at this stage.
Okay. Yes.
Might I suggest that the suggestion by the CMA that the vulnerability is defined. Well, in section 30 of their submission, they set out an alternative way of looking at vulnerability, looking at the causes of vulnerability rather than trying to define it rigidly as it does in the bill. Perhaps that has merit.
That's fine, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. The definition of consumer in the bill as currently drafted does not include small business. Do you see this as an issue in practice, given that other consumer-facing legislation does include and cover small businesses, for example, some small businesses up to 5 or 10 employees? Yeah, please.
My team sit within COSLAN, so our submission's been through both our governance board and the Community Wellbeing Board before coming here, and it was an issue raised at the Community Wellbeing Board that they felt that this was an issue, that small and micro businesses, of which there are many in Scotland, would be disadvantaged potentially through this. Clearly, there are other UK consumer protection statutes which do include small and micro businesses. So I suppose the question would be why does this one not? Most European legislation for consumer protection does not, but individual member states have taken the decision to extend it where appropriate. And an interesting area perhaps is the work that's been done by the Scottish Government in terms of delivery surcharges. And actually delivery surcharges affect many of the small and micro businesses based in rural Scotland who are sending things out, as well as consumers who are trying to buy things in. Yes, there's a question there about whether the provisions could be strengthened.
Okay, thank you.
So currently we would refer business-to-business issue to the relevant trading standards. As an organisation with the correct training, we would have no reservation about supporting small and micro businesses.
Graham, do you have a view on this question?
Not really. It very much depends upon what Consumer Scotland wants to define a consumer as. I mean, certainly within my view, we define that there are some instances where sole traders and business entities like that are defined within as a consumer. But it's certainly when it comes to business advice, we will provide business advice to large companies and to small businesses on the basis that they're a business, not a consumer.
I just wondered, given your experience of this on an everyday basis, if the definition of consumer is limited to individuals and doesn't cover like sole traders or small micro business, what will be the practical implications? Will there be a sort of two-tier system? Will small traders, with 1 or 2 employees or even just 1 employee, they'll be left to their own device, so they'll be excluded from the system here?
Well, local authority trading standard services provide business advice. And we're available to provide that business advice, whether it's in whichever form that business may want. Quite whether we've got the capacity to still to do that as much as we would like is a question, but it is certainly one of our primary goals is to prevent consumer detriment by visiting traders, advising them on how to comply with the law and changes to the law, etc. Certainly with regards to cigarettes and NVP, that law has changed considerably over the last few years, and we have been at pains to go out and visit sometimes they are small corner shop businesses, and we provide them with the necessary materials to comply. So that facility is already there, and if businesses want advice, we're here to help.
We wouldn't see a scenario where we let people fall through the cracks. We'll either deal with it ourselves, or we'll speak to our colleagues and understand what the most appropriate route. But rest assured, we're certainly not going to sit back and watch, sole traders and micro businesses just fall through the cracks. That'll be picked up very, very quickly.
But I guess ultimately it then becomes a question of resource, right? If you get a certain amount of resource to cover a certain expected number of so-called consumers who need help, if small business is excluded, you might not have the resource provided to back that up.
From our perspective, in terms of resource, I think bluntly that's our challenge.
Okay.
So if we are successful and we get far more people to contact us, and we're 18% up year on year just on the old channels, that's not including the new ones, we need to go to the Scottish Government on an evidence-based basis to say, actually, we need more resource to do this. And we also need to take feedback from Graham and all the other trading standards managers across Scotland. We've already all met twice. There'll be a third meeting in the near future where we understand our different pressures and make sure that the consumer gets the best outcome.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Jackie Bailey.
The bill is going to create a consumer duty on public bodies. Do you support this, and what difference do you actually think it will make in practice?
Well,
Graham.
if I might, as someone who writes committee reports to local authorities to make decisions on spending, etc., the consumer duty is welcome, but I can see it being one of many considerations that local authorities have to balance when it comes to making decisions on spending. So it's welcome, but it'll go into the pile with the rest of them, such as environmental considerations, financial considerations, HR, all these other considerations which local authorities have a duty to consider when making decisions.
Okay, thank you. Andrew?
We would welcome anything that improves protection for consumers, so we would support it.
How do you think it improves protection for consumers?
It's being thought of at a policy level, so it's just one strand of informed policy making.
I think what we've just heard is it's almost a tick box exercise. I used to write committee reports as well, so there's a list at the end of considerations that require to have been taken. Graham?
I would say it's not a tick box exercise at all. I apologise if I gave you that impression. It's not a tick box exercise. When we consider these points, we do look at them all and say, well, this is going to impact this way, this is going to impact that way. Here's how we strike the balance. The consumer duty would be exactly the same. We would see how that would affect consumers and strike a balance. It has to be that way.
Fiona?
So again, supportive of putting consumers at the heart of policy making, obviously. One of the things that we would hope that it might help avoid is what certainly my team we would refer to as the Green Deal fiasco, where the UK government brought in the Green Deal without proper consideration of consumer protection or at any point, and that has meant that a lot of consumers have suffered detriment because of that UK government-backed scheme. So we would hope that it would help mitigate that happening if people actually thought about the unintended consequences of policies when you were designing them. I suppose much on the consumer duty is going to depend on the guidance round about it as that develops, and at the moment, it's very much a headline duty to consider consumers when making policy, and I don't think anybody can really argue against that. It will depend on the guidance. Again, within the financial memorandum, it says there'll be no extra burden for local authorities, but adding another duty, statutory duty to local authorities, will of course create some additional burden for them, unless it just does become a tick box exercise, in which case there's no point in bringing it in. So there's...
Thank you very much.
Yes, just on that consumer duty, I mean, I don't think the bill gives any particular specific mechanism as to how that is to be enforced, does it? So it's a duty that is simply a policy aspect of decision making, or how would you describe it? I mean, how is this going to actually make any difference to anything?
I suppose the intention is that when making policy or making strategic decisions, that public bodies consider what the effects of those strategic decisions will have on consumers. But without the detail of how they're going to do that and what that actually means, it's difficult to see what impact it's going to have.
Right. And Graham Payton?
Yeah, certainly Consumer Scotland could perhaps use that duty to go back to those decision makers and ask them how they took into consideration the consumer duty when they made their decisions. and Consumer Scotland will be able to assess how much of a tick box exercise it was, or how much it was rigorously examined before the decision was taken. I would go for the latter.
All right. Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much again, Convener. I wonder if I could just ask the panel their views on the consumer-trader interface. Very much these days it's not personal, it's online, or it's on phone, it's call centre contact. Do you think we've strengthened or weakened the ability of the consumer to get redress or representation because of the model of that interface?
Andrew Bartlett.
Well, you'd be surprised to learn that I think it's strengthened that this is about access. So it's giving people access to authoritative information, actionable solutions to their problems, and tools if they're using. So if somebody wants to go along to a face-to-face agency, then that is the most appropriate thing for them to do. So we're not advocating that we divert all funding from face-to-face agencies online, and we don't have a face-to-face presence in local communities. For people who work, for example, the online world is essential. Lots and lots of people are really confident now doing business on the phone. My mother is 76 and is an avid phone user. She would not go online, however, and exercise her rights. If we look at younger people, for example, they live in an online world. So we need to make, in my opinion, advice and information available on all channels. So we will launch WhatsApp next year, not to be trendy, but because there's an incredible number of people who use that as a day-to-day tool, and it will encourage them to seek advice and information.
Fiona?
I suppose our concern are those people that don't complain anywhere. And how we find out about their problems, because they tend to be the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged, and they maybe don't complain because they don't feel that they are capable or empowered to do so, or they know how to do so. For me, there's that bit about the whole hidden detriment piece, and how we assess that and measure that, and maybe there's a role for Consumer Scotland to play there in terms of their research.
Graham?
Yeah, there was in the Scots response to the consultation, we pointed out some research that was done in Dumfries and Galloway, which found that those on low incomes were less likely to complain about consumer detriment or make complaints. So that there are those are the areas that Consumer Scotland perhaps concentrate on, as Fiona says, to point out to people, to consumers, what their rights are, and to empower them to complain. Perhaps reaching out to those particular areas would be beneficial.
It's perhaps not at the complaint stage. It's, imagine a person just buys something from a trader online or in a shop or whatever, and just has an issue about how to set it up or get it working or something like that before it even comes to you guys. Is that model as good as it can be? Because I often hear from constituents that it takes half an hour on the phone and you're sitting for ages waiting on a call centre management system and a hierarchy of buttons to press, and you never actually get to speak to anybody. And it's always, automated stuff. And is that really the best we can do you think, for consumers?
I think there's lots of traders who could improve their customer service. Because that's really what we're but I can assure you, you will not wait ages if you ring consumeradvice.scotland.
But see, is there an issue there? Should this be something we should look at? Should Consumer Scotland try to influence that kind of agenda?
Is that an advocacy issue? Is that something that they could be speaking on behalf of consumers?
Okay.
I hate those hierarchical buttons when I have to make choices. So if we could just ban them entirely, I'd be happy.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much to our three witnesses, and I'll suspend the meeting to allow changeover of witnesses. Thank you for coming in. We now come to item 3 on our agenda, or in fact we're still on item 2, which is our consideration of the Consumer Scotland Bill, and we have our second panel of witnesses, starting from my left to right. First of all, Professor Ian Black, Professor in Marketing at the University of Stirling, Sarah O'Neill from Sarah O'Neill Consulting, Sheila Scobie, who is the Director of Nations Competition and Markets Authority, James Walker, Chief Executive Officer of Resolver, and Graham Wynne, Assistant Director for Consumer Competition and Regulatory Affairs from the British Retail Consortium. So welcome to all 5 of you. Could I start by asking what you think the what Consumer Scotland can add to the landscape we have in terms of protection of consumers? What would you say that it brings to the table, or what could it bring? Don't know who would like to come in first on that. Graham Wynne.
Thank you, convener. I think that the key thing is that it should do something unique rather than duplicating what's already there. And in terms of consumer advice, which we would see as one of the key roles, of course, that it should be looking at some new areas that other agencies aren't necessarily looking at. And that means, from our perspective, as our submission suggested, that the digital economy is one of those things as it affects consumers, because we have a whole new way of retailing which involves the digital economy, AI, personalised advertising, use of personal data, and video surveillance, strip pricing, in-store tracking, cloud computing, and all these raise a lot of issues for consumers as to their rights and whether or not they should be worried about these things or not. And I think that what Consumer Scotland could do is give advice to examine these issues and give advice to consumers on these new types of retailing and uses of technology, digital technology, that bodies such as Citizens Advice and others who give very good personalised advice on personal information and personal difficulties and personal consumer issues. I think it's time that there was a body that was able to look at this broader issues, not just digital retailing, but this is an example, and give consumers some advice on these very broad, difficult issues that others don't have the time or resources necessarily to look at. So I think that's one thing that it could do that other bodies could do, but probably don't have the resources or time or actually the targeting to do it.
All right, thank you. Sarah O'Neill.
Thank you. Well, my take on this is informed by my time working for Consumer Focus, and before that at Scottish Consumer Council for many years. And what I see is that since that was abolished, which was finally abolished in 2014, there are a number of areas where there are gaps at the moment. For example, public services and legal services were major areas of work for Consumer Focus, and I don't see that anyone's kind of taken on that role in the last few years. I think we need an overarching advocacy body which is carrying out research at a high level. I don't think there are a lot of areas where research was previously done and that hasn't happened in recent years. So I think that there's a gap there that needs to be filled, and I think it has to be very clear that Consumer Scotland should not be doing work in things that other people are working on, that it should be working with others, and clearly it has a duty to do that. But certainly my experience of working in consumer advocacy organisations was that was very much how we did do things. We always would speak to others, work out what other people were working on, we'd collaborate if we could, and we would only use our powers if we absolutely had to.
Professor Black.
Thank you. So I'm speaking on behalf of myself and academics from other of Scotland's leading universities setting business schools, people like Deirdre Shaw is a professor of consumer research. So we're bringing maybe some of the academic and research evidence here regarding consumption and consumers and consumer harm. So I think we would be broadly in favour of a modified version of Consumer Scotland that would very much broaden the definition of what a consumer and consumption is away from the point of acquisition We have to be very careful with the notion of using a consumer frame in a time of environmental crisis, because a consumer frame very much brings it with an individualism and an expectation of more and more consumption, and that's wholly incompatible with climate crisis. We would also suggest that there's opportunity here for co-regulation rather than self-regulation to make sure that that we're keeping a close eye on the activities of business. And I think very much so the other point that we bring in here is that the notion of broadening the notions of harm away into environmental harm. That consumers need to be protected from the environmental harm caused by manufacturers and our global supply chains. And those people who are most vulnerable to harm from the environment are those living in poverty within our country.
All right, I think we'll move on to Gordon MacDonald now. And
thanks very much, Convener. Before I move on to my own question, I was wanting to ask, in terms of gap in provision, I understand there is concern over how this new organisation will fit in with the existing landscape of consumer support organisations. But is there enough provision out there to provide advice, etc., to any consumer that's got a problem? We've saw evidence that approximately 22% of citizens' advice work is consumer related, and there was an Audit Scotland report that came out a couple of years ago said that 1.3 million people in Scotland would have potentially problems with goods and services and had the grounds to complain, and that 22% of Citizens Advice Scotland's workload works out about 54,000 clients. So is there enough capacity out there to provide the advice for consumers?
James Walker.
Yes, so I mean, I think that's an interesting question, but I would probably answer it by saying that we see more than Citizens Advice Scotland as being one of the sources of information intelligence to ourselves, and I think other enforcers in the landscape. There are a number of third sector organisations, some who have very specific targeted responsibilities for looking at particular sectors like Transport Focus, I suppose. So one of the roles I think you could envisage Consumer Scotland playing is to coordinate information and intelligence across all of those advice services, ranging from information that's come in perhaps through the Citizens Advice Bureau, but also some of the information that might come in via Advice Direct Scotland or perhaps Resolver if they're tapping into intelligence channels as well. There's something about coordinating information and then identifying the issues that really matter for consumers.
I mean, I accept that point. I mean, I've got a couple of independent organisations in my own constituency, but I'm just wondering about the capacity issue. Is there enough capacity out there to give good advice to consumers?
I'm not sure I would have a particular view on that. I think, I mean, Citizens Advice Scotland, took over, as Sarah mentioned, from Consumer Focus and the Consumer Council, and has been supported over the years to provide that service. Certainly, as far as my organisation is concerned, we feel that we've been able to tap into Citizens Advice Scotland's data. They've shared information with us. They've kept us updated on information around Scottish consumers that has fed into our process. So I don't personally see a gap, but nonetheless, our view is, I think as Fiona Richardson said, there may well be consumers who are not complaining, maybe information about issues happening in sectors that we don't have oversight of. And I think if Consumer Scotland can identify those and really get into those sectors, then that could be a very useful source of advice and intelligence for us.
James, I think you were indicating.
Yes, thank you. So, in answering your question, is there sufficient capacity? I think on a very simplistic level, yes. The issue, I think there's two issues that exist. One is the effort that the consumer needs to make to raise an issue. And as part of that, their belief of whether it's worth raising it or not. I.e., if this is going to take me 25 minutes on a phone, is it worth doing, or do I just give up? So I think that there is an effort element. There is a second element, which is then who are vulnerable, who need more assistance and more time. And actually, the more that consumers can be self-help to do stuff, the more that there is time available to help those that are vulnerable. And I think the vulnerable element is the hard one. I was just looking at the data, and a good example for the energy sector, the consumer in Scotland's about 3 or 4% more likely to be vulnerable than in England and Wales. So you can see that there is a shift. There's also more people were sold PPI by the looks in Scotland, looking at the payout rates within the finance sector for resolution. So there are variants between different sectors in the UK and different geographies. But the important part is that if you can have a method which has the least amount of effort for the consumer and allows those that need the most assistance to be able to get it, then you have capacity in the system. The issue is where the people are in the wrong channel to get the aid that they need is where you end up having problems.
To move on to my own question, the bill gives Consumer Scotland a fairly broad range of powers, including advice provision, views of consumers, collecting information, organising research, carrying out investigations. Given the existing consumer landscape, has the bill got the right balance between each of these areas?
Overall, I think so. As Fiona said, they very much mirror the provisions of the Consumer Estate Agents and Redress Act. And it's difficult to know what the balance should be between giving it sufficient flexibility to interpret it for itself and how prescriptive you want to be about what it should do. For example, when it talks about advice and information, what I take from that primarily is it's about giving advice to government and others, but about providing consumer information rather than necessarily providing advice. And that's something that Scottish Consumer Council and Consumer Focus did a lot of. We produced a lot of information guides for consumers where we identified that there was a need for that from our research. So, for example, we published a booklet on common repairs, which was one of our most successful publications. It was very, very popular, and that hasn't been updated since the Property Factors Act came into force because nobody's been looking at that. And we did guides on access to personal information, education law for parents, all sorts of things like that. So to me, that's another thing that this allows Consumer Scotland to do, and perhaps where there are gaps identified and there's a need for people to have that information so they can help themselves, as we heard, and that's something else that I think is useful to look at.
Thanks very much.
I think from my side, 2 points. One is that I think the information gathering should not be underestimated. There are lots of sources of information, and bringing them all together to be able to have an understanding of the landscape, I think, is key and important. A very good example is if you are living in the Scottish Islands, actually per 1,000 head of population, you make the most complaints about flight delays in the whole of the UK. You wouldn't see that if you look at numbers, because you just see the numbers are small from the number of cases coming through. I think the second part is coordination within the market. There are a number of players to help them make sure that they're acting effectively together and all in unison and in the right direction, and minimising overlap, therefore actually allows us to have more effective and efficient consumer support.
Yes, I think it probably does have the right balance and certainly the right aspects of consumer requirements. I think that advice and information, as I've perhaps indicated, are the key to its capacities. It's clearly not going to be able to provide redress, individual redress. His organisation does. I've used it. It's very good. And they resolved my problem within half an hour that I've been trying to deal with for a couple of days. So it is possible, even for a vulnerable consumer like me who's over 60. Apparently I'm vulnerable because I'm over 60. But I don't know how many others are. But which I think is rather strange. But I think that the key thing is the provision of advice and information, but we have a slight concern over investigations, only really that they do need safeguards, I think, especially the ones that look for information from businesses, because we hope that it would be a request first, then a really evidence-based request, and not just a fishing exercise, because a lot of information can be confidential, and there's a need to sometimes keep it confidential. That doesn't mean that, and it mustn't duplicate the CMA's role in this, I think, in market studies and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, generally, the SRC, who I'm here today to represent, even though I'm from the BRC, is supportive of the bill and as a whole, and the aspects, as long as they're coordinated, that it looks at. But one or two things we just need to be sure that that it's going to operate in a proportionate and sensible way.
Okay. Sarah O'Neill.
I can't make a comment on the number of the specific provision, but I would make a comment about the overall direction of this, to say that essentially what we're doing here is putting the onus on the victim. And then the victim has to come, and the victim of substantial financial loss, goods and services that don't work. The one thing that none of us can get back is time. So 45 minutes on a phone is 45 minutes we will never get back at the end of our lives. These things are important as we get older. But what we're doing here is saying that we'll inspect the consumer will then make the complaint, and do we have the capacity there? I think there has to be further consideration of the regulation on the people who are causing the problems. And that there's the other regulations tight enough. Is there an inspectorate around to ensure that the goods and services that they're providing are of merchantable quality, that don't damage the environment? Do they have a long list of histories of Phoenix corporations where they just go round and round and round? This is where I think I'd prefer to see additional capacity, so we don't have to spend our lives on even getting fantastic advice from fantastic organisations. In many ways, putting your company out of business, your organisations out of business, would be success, because the organisations aren't doing these things that they know that they shouldn't do.
So do you think should change to the bill to reflect that?
I think that we are you're looking at the too far down the chain here, down at the consumers, and of course we need to protect citizen consumers. I would contest the notion of consumers, but very much so that the regulation and the inspectorate to stop the business doing it in the first place is where we could absolutely provide a different view from the UK.
Sarah?
Well, I think the point I was going to make probably ties into that. I mean, for me, the main focus of this organisation should be on advocating for the consumer at the beginning of the policy process. So it should have a very preventative approach so that we don't end up with problems further down the line. And I think that's where the consumer duty comes in as well. It's about trying to identify issues before they actually occur so that consumers don't suffer further down the line. And I think it kind of relates to the point in investigation, because to me what investigation actually means in this context is research. It's actually doing some in-depth diving into a particular issue and trying to find out what the issues are and look at recommendations for resolving those issues. And I think that's the key to all of this. And I think the other really important point about this is for a consumer advocacy organisation, it needs to be building relationships on an ongoing basis, because that's how it finds out what the consumer issues are that need to be addressed, and that's how it actually builds the relationships that allow it to do its work, because people trust it, they understand what it does, they will provide information without it having to use its powers. So I think that's absolutely key to this. That has to be ongoing, it has to be speaking to people on a regular basis, being involved in things like Consumer Protection Partnership, being on Scottish Government working groups, giving evidence to Parliament. All those kind of things are part of it, in my view.
Jill?
I just want to, follow on from what Sarah said. The exemplar, I think, for this to some extent is the Consumer Council in Northern Ireland, which has broadly got the same sort of powers that Consumer Scotland is going to be given, and it's been using those powers for a number of years now very effectively, I think. Following on from this point about working in partnership, the key recommendation that the CMA made to the Scottish Government around Consumer Scotland was that it should, as CCNI does for Northern Ireland, take its place in the wider UK landscape, so it can be more effective being part of that partnership, looking at some of those issues, perhaps the digital economy, that really are affecting consumers across the UK and not just in Scotland.
Okay, thanks so much.
And Con Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to come back on some comments that Professor Black made. He has suggested that focusing on well-being, and I would like perhaps a definition of what the panel think well-being would be, rather than consumer harm, would allow Consumer Scotland to achieve more, particularly in relation to environmental issues. What does the panel think about that? I mean, perhaps Professor Black might like to
I was only
kick off.
I think the importance of well-being is is also trying to fit this consumer bill into the broader goals of the Scottish Government. That taking harm and consumer harm is a very narrow field, where in fact the goal of the Scottish Government, the goal set by the Scottish Government, the National Performance Framework, is that we want to increase well-being. We want to increase health, people's happiness, people's enjoyment, people's social interactions, the community. If we take that as a view of what we're trying to achieve, then we don't focus so much just on the very narrow issues of was it sold at the was the pack size correct? Was what was delivered the same as that was advertised? So I think it fits in with our broader view here. If we can make take the important aspects of what Consumer Scotland can do, and with some changes into its definitions, fitted into the wider goals of the Scottish Government, and that takes out of the individualist nature of a consumer, of what I got out of this. If we brought it into well-being, then we can start to look at some of the social benefits and and social harms that the agency can try and prevent as well.
Danger widening it out like that, the focus will become diffused, that, you know, at the end of the day, it is the consumer that's being supported, hopefully. And yes, the wider approach on well-being sounds good, but if we're sort of moving it up to that level, do we not lose the individual focus as well?
Yes, I'm making life more difficult for you. I mean, we could try and replicate the mechanisms that are down elsewhere, or we can try and fit in this agency into the wider goals of government. It does put on a broader range of mechanisms, a broader range of targets that would need to be examined. But I think we've got to also take into account that we aren't consumers. There's no such thing as being a consumer. What we are is an MSP who consumes, a father who consumes, a mother who buys things for their family, a father who buys things for their family. If I ask my students, can you write who you are? None of them say a consumer. They go through all of them, a football player, I'm a mother, you know, all of these things. So I think we have to make sure that we cite the protection into that role of where things that we buy a much wider part of who we are as our families, the roles we play in society, the communities that we live in. And then when we take that broader view, then we I think provide a stronger support for individuals and families and communities.
What do the rest of the panel feel, Sarah?
Well, I think that's an interesting point to make. I mean, I think I've often struggled with the word consumer, because so much of the work I've been involved in is actually looking at consumers of public services who don't pay for the service, but they still need it. It's an essential service. It's often the people who are most vulnerable who rely on those services. But I would see it more as, rather than thinking about individual consumers, because there's no such thing as the consumer. Everybody's different. We all have different needs and things like that. Is looking at the collective consumer interest. So I don't see that as not, I mean, I can see that's fitting within this. We're looking at the collective consumer interest rather than individual consumers. But I do think that brings in interesting issues, as Ian mentioned, about looking at, you know, we did work in sustainable development and the consumer about 20 years ago at Scottish Consumer Council, and it kind of fell by the wayside because it wasn't a priority. But I agree that those are issues we should be thinking of going forward, and thinking about what is the collective consumer interest. And it's not just people who consume a service at the moment, but who might consume it but they can't get access to it, future consumers, and that's a key one when we're talking about climate change. Well, how is this going to impact on future consumers, and how do we balance their interests with current consumers?
So I think dividing this into probably two elements, and the first element is I think it's actually that well-being is being delivered by how I see this body working, which is it is not helping the individual, it is making sure that the knowledge of all the issues that individuals have are collated, gathered, turned into information and knowledge to help with actually the direction of policy. to therefore help protect consumers. So in essence, what you're doing is taking up from the market and learning to make sure that actually consumer issues are dealt with. What I think that perhaps missing when looking more on that well-being is the element of trust that exists or does not exist between businesses and consumers. You know, we see often reported about issues with the quality of reviews and whether you can trust reviews. We've talked here earlier about whether that there should be an ADR scheme for Scotland. All of these elements are about the trust that exists between consumers and businesses and whether you trust to do business. And the danger that a consumer has in making a decision where they don't have knowledge. Well, actually, your well-being comes into that, of being able to know that if I do something, I'm protected and I'm looked after. The environmental angle, I think, is another part of it and not something that I'd consider to be fair in our response or my consideration. But if you look at this from any part of an environmental chain, and if, let's say, for example, you start thinking in terms of a circular economy, then all of these parts still play into it. You still have effectively both players that need to be able to trust each other. And actually having a trust within the marketplace, I think, is an important element as well.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting debate, and I think it sort of pertains to the consumer duty on public authorities that's the provision in the bill, because I think inevitably public authorities that are going to be subject to that duty, you know, we've heard they have a range of other statutory duties. Inevitably, they are going to be making those judgments about well-being in considering those consumer aspects, which I think could be loosely defined as things around price and quality, convenience, fairness, trust, and some of those other public policy outcomes like safety, health, environmental issues. And I think it will be for public authorities to make the right judgment based on all the duties that will be applying to them. So I think it will inevitably be a consequence of that duty that those sort of well-being issues will be considered.
That's good.
I think that obviously that would provide a unique perspective, and there are the different perspective and different role for a consumer, nominally consumer body. It would seem to be more about citizens. They're citizens are consumers, so where do you draw the line? But it seems to me it's the sort of thing that perhaps the body could commission some research on and a paper on, maybe you'd like to provide it, or maybe that's the idea. But nevertheless, it seems to me that it shouldn't be its core duty, but nevertheless something that shouldn't be excluded.
Did you want to come back in?
A couple of things. I mean, the Wellbeing Alliance is what I was talking about. We were talking in the submission was the Wellbeing Alliance and the Wellbeing Economy Forum, of which the First Minister has attended with the First Minister of Iceland. So there is a well-known and well-structured know of what a wellbeing economy is and looks like. And the second thing, just the way you were juxtaposing consumer and citizen consumer again is a well-known frame, but it does bring in the social and the community to the individual. And I think that's a strong way of looking at the way of framing this.
Just to move on to something slightly different. Consumer Scotland doesn't actually have an explicit role in considering competition issues. Is that a problem?
Well, it feels like that's the right question to ask me. I mean,
yes, I think it was for you.
I mean, I don't think you can separate competition and consumer. Although we are called the Competition and Markets Authority, we are the Competition and Consumer Authority and have powers for consumer protection as well as competition enforcement powers. And when we do our work, very much we are thinking about both competition and consumer at the same time. And you know, our duty as a competition authority is very much to promote competition for the benefit of consumers. So I don't think you can disentangle them. I mean, very much I think Consumer Scotland can play a role, as I think its Consumer Focus and Citizens Advice Scotland now does, in informing us of how markets are working for consumers, how they're actually experiencing those power dynamics in markets, the trust issues, the questions about poverty premium, loyalty premium, all these sorts of issues that we would not have a focus on unless we were hearing from consumer organisations about how it was affecting both individual consumers and collectors of consumers. So very much I think Consumer Scotland could play a role in informing us in how we exercise our competition enforcement powers.
Do the panel members have a view?
I would absolutely agree with what Sheila says, having worked previously with the Office of Fair Trading and then the Consumer and Markets Authority, Competition and Markets Authority. Yes, absolutely. We worked very closely together on particular issues that we were involved in. For example, Scottish Consumer Council raised issues about the property factors market, and the Office of Fair Trading, which was the predecessor of the CMA, took that up and did a market study, and that ultimately eventually led to the Property Factors Act, which is now in place. So we worked very closely on a number of issues, competition in the legal services market as well, and we have different perspectives on that, but clearly CMA is the body that has the role to investigate markets and actually can take enforcement action if necessary.
Well, I just noticed in our submission we said that the underlying concept that open markets and consumer protection are inextricably linked. Empowered consumers can drive up standards in consumer-facing business. And actually that was, I think, the underlying proposal and proposition for this whole thing from the Scottish Government, and that we certainly support that approach, that good competition between businesses is a very important element in giving consumers the goods and services that they need at the best possible prices. So that that would seem to be an underlying concept anyway, whether it needs a specific role to look at the competition elements. And of course the CMA has, Lord Thierry has put forward some very interesting points on the consumer perspective, both in competition and in its consumer role. So that I think that that should underlie any approach anyway. So.
Good morning. Some respondents to the committee's call for views have suggested Consumer Scotland could have a role in streamlining the consumer landscape. Do you agree or not? And if so, how could this work in practice?
James Walker.
James.
So I think I actually go back to some of Andrew's comments earlier, or one of Andrew's comments earlier in the previous session, which is I'm not sure what streamlining provides when actually consumers have a tendency to go to where they want to go rather than where you want them to be, is the reality of it. Consumers engage in services that they think are the ones that will help them most. So actually, rather than necessarily a streamlining from the consumer perspective, is this more about actually how do you make sure consumers are supported in the way that they want to engage? You know, a really good example is that our largest user group is 18 to 24-year-olds, which is probably the area that Advice Direct Scotland has a limited number of people. I'm guessing, I'm making a little presumption, because they're the ones that people say are hardest to be able to engage with. So I think that there is perhaps not a lack of streamlining that's needed at that front-end element of how consumers engage. Where there is potentially streamlining is actually how data becomes put together, how therefore policy is enacted or recommendations are dealt with. Rather than everyone doing it separately, how can actually economies of scale come into play with a greater set of knowledge?
Okay. Anyone else? Do you think it's harder being a consumer, Professor Black? Is it harder being a consumer? I know you don't like that word, but I'll still use it.
No, I think in many ways in the market-driven world that we live in, it's incredibly empowering. There's no doubt about it. If you've got the money and you're a consumer, you can have the life you want. You'll have people treating you as we've been talking about for years. The consumer is king. I don't quite like that frame, but the notion that you have money, you can have choice, you can travel where you want to as frequently as you want to. I think it's enormously empowering, but there comes an enormous social cost. It comes a cost to the person, and it comes an enormous environmental cost. So I know, if the way that our economy is constructed, being a consumer with money is the best possible position. It's just not good for the common good and not good for the environment.
Yeah, you can only wear one pair of shoes at a time. Thank you.
Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thanks very much, and good morning to the panel. A couple of the issues I was looking to cover have been covered already, actually, but I was just looking for how you feel Consumer Scotland should use the proposed powers it'll have to either provide or commission advice itself.
Any takers? Graham Wynne.
I'll kick off just to get rid of the silence. I think that, well, as I said, I think the real thing is the real contribution it could make is to look at new issues rather than trying to duplicate advice that's already out there and given very well by existing organisations. There is such a thing, I think, though, as information overload for consumers, and indeed Which and I think it was BIS did a survey and one or two other organisations a few years ago where they found that consumers don't look at information, they don't look at advice, and we know that happens anyway because product recalls just don't get through to people. People ignore them. People ignore the notices. People ignore the communications with them. And so I think that it's important to be targeted in these things and to give, as I said at the beginning, Consumer Scotland perhaps well, not unique, but a different role, and to make sure that it's looking at topics that, in terms of advice to consumers, and very deliberate advice, on those sorts of things that other organisations don't have the resources to do. And I mentioned the digital economy, AI, Internet of Things. How do you make sure things are secure? How do you make sure that you keep things up to date in terms of security? And should people worry about this? I mean, there's certain things, for example, I noticed that Microsoft, not to particularly point the finger at them, but they closed their cloud service for books. And people didn't realise that they didn't own the book, they owned the access to the book, and there were quite a number of complaints, so they no longer had access. And these sorts of things are a whole new economy that people don't necessarily understand, but they wouldn't necessarily go to some of the existing organisations to get advice, whereas Consumer Scotland could, as I say, give some broad advice and information on these sorts of things. What should consumers look out for in terms of using their own data as money and all these concepts that we hear about, and should they be nervous, should they be welcoming? And I think that that could be a particular role, and it needs to carve out its own role, and a particularly different one, ideally, from everyone else, while coordination and not overlapping.
We've heard from the committee from a number of evidence sessions that that the new body could do higher level research and promotion. But what would stop the same, if that resource that was provided for the new body being provided to different existing bodies with perhaps special interests, for example, those who look after older people or within certain sectors, what would stop them doing that work if the resource was made available to them instead?
Well, if you were addressing well, nothing, I guess, in terms of if you give them the right resources, other than possibly that it would divert their attention from what they perhaps do best and are best known for, and that might be to the detriment, ultimately, of the role they already perform. But obviously, if you have resources, you can do things, and that's the same with Consumer Scotland. It all depends on the resources.
So yes, James Walker.
So I was going to say that I guess you could get another organisation, existing organisation, to do everything that Consumer Scotland could do. What to me is the fundamental is trying to take sources of information from lots of different sources and to work with it, to look at the bigger picture, which if one organisation is doing, they never are able to see. I will see certain trends that Citizens Advice may not see, or Advice Direct Scotland may not see, and they will see some stuff that we don't see. But when you start to look at everything together, you start to get a bigger picture. And the one point that probably is a slight concern of mine is that if you are thinking always of the future, then you have a tendency of being in danger of missing the now.
And part of what this is about, in my head anyway, is to try and help prevent something being the front page of the Daily Mail, i.e. where it's being picked up that the Daily Mail's managed to notice that there's a problem and government hasn't noticed that there's a problem. Is that when you start to look at the bigger picture about what's going on and has the ability to influence the different players in the market and their position in the market to therefore make sure that action is taken rather than just actually acknowledging that there's a problem. I think that to me is the key part.
That's very interesting, actually, what you say about that kind of that top end kind of, or the overarching kind of side of it. And I suppose again, then I would say was how do we make sure that Consumer Scotland doesn't then focus perhaps on what has seemed to be maybe the high profile and popular issues, but actually focus on the important areas where there isn't that coverage being done, or there isn't that coordination being done at the moment.
Comes down to the first bit is actually the direction that is set and the objectives that it is set and the way that it uses and interprets data to actually turn it into knowledge. You know, I'll go back to one of my previous points, is that who would know, or who knows at the moment, that actually the most flight delays per head of population are in the Scottish Islands in the whole of the UK. Yeah, probably. Yeah, but from a regulation perspective, I've never seen it come up. The same on issues on parcel delivery in Scotland in the same areas. Yeah. That actually, whilst you could say that those are hot topics at the moment, they actually have a significant impact as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's almost chasing the headlines to be something that isn't important.
Good. I don't know if there's anybody who wants to add anything else to that. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important here is the forward work plan, and I think the organisation would want to set out criteria as to why it would do certain pieces of work and why those pieces of work were important. For example, what's the level of detriment, how many people will it affect, is anyone else working on it? And I would see that as something you would consult on before publishing your work programme. You'd speak to all of the relevant players, all of your stakeholders, and say, well, what are the key issues? It might be stuff that's on the front page of the Daily Mail, it might not. Parcel deliveries is something that Consumer Focus worked on, and it still seems to be an issue, possibly partly because it's a reserved issue. And it's one of those issues where often there aren't that many differences in terms of consumers in Scotland and how they experience things, but the main reason would be issues of rurality. That's generally what the differences are. It's usually about access to services, difficulty in getting things, higher prices, those kind of issues. So I would have thought that, I would certainly hope that this organisation would be focusing on the issues that affect the most consumers with the greatest detriment and those who are vulnerable. But just on the point about advice, I just wanted to echo what was said, that I would be concerned that if it was seen to be providing advice itself, it would need to be very clear how that was being done. You know, having been on the receiving end of that kind of thing in a policy team, somebody phoning looking for advice, the staff aren't necessarily qualified, and it can take up a lot of time, and it does divert you from your core work. But if what was being suggested, as I understand from previous evidence sessions, is that perhaps an advice body might be taken within the auspices of Consumer Scotland, I think that would be different, as long as you were very clear that you were branding it differently. We had that at Consumer Focus with the Extra Help Unit, which now sits with Citizens Advice Scotland and helps vulnerable energy consumers. That was branded very differently, and so while it was in our office, people didn't contact the main office. It was seen as a separate entity, so it might work if you did that. And in terms of commissioning advice, I think that's sort of overseeing advice is very difficult, because consumer advice is very difficult to separate out from other issues. How do you separate consumer advice from debt advice, from housing advice, from employment advice? Because people tend to experience problems in clusters, which is what all the research says. And we have lots of other advice provision in Scotland at the moment. The recent Legal Aid Review looked at all of this, about the coordination of legal advice and assistance, and I think that consumer advice can't be looked at separately. It would have to be looked at within that context, and how it fits best with all the other advice that's out there.
Thank you.
Jackie Bailey.
Just on that point, because I'm conscious that Sarah O'Neill conducted a piece of research into Citizens Advice Scotland and the provision of legal assistance. I am that anorak that read the report. So given what you've just said, where do you see Consumer Scotland bringing that additionality? Because we're very conscious of what Citizens Advice Scotland does, and you described that kind of cluster of problems which they are good at resolving. So where does Consumer Scotland sit? How does it bring additionality? That's, I think, what we need clarity on.
Even in terms of advice or in general?
In general.
Well, in general, I think citizens' advice, as you've read my report, it makes a massive contribution to access to justice in Scotland and the work that it does. Most of its work is actually, as you will know, focused on benefits, on debt, on housing issues, on employment. And even, I think I'm right in saying that what they categorise as consumer issues is actually primarily debt-related. So I think that they provide very good advice to the people that they serve, but they have a very particular constituency, so it's not necessarily representative of the whole population. So I think the other issue, I suppose, is that the issues that are seen by citizens' advice are the issues which have already arisen, where people have had problems. And what I'm saying is I think we need to get in much earlier and try and identify potential issues before they actually become problems further down the line. I think both are important, but I think that that's something that Consumer Scotland could add. It could be looking at other issues that might affect huge numbers of people, some of whom may be vulnerable and may not go to citizens' advice or other advice agencies.
Okay, thank you.
Questions from the Deputy Convener.
Thanks very much. I wonder if I could just talk about data gathering and data usage and issues there. Both Graham and Sheila talked about the digital economy, and I wanted to ask you your views on issues relating to this. Do you remember the old days when you bought something, you hardly ever heard from the seller ever again, or you might have got an annual letter to service your car or something like that, or to insure your TV or something. But now you get bombarded constantly with opportunities to buy things, don't you? And if you use these devices, you must be aware that there's things going on with people's personal data that's been gathered and collected, perhaps without our knowledge. Well, definitely without our knowledge. Where do you think that issue sits in this agenda? And has Consumer Scotland got any kind of role it can play there to try and protect citizens, consumers, or whatever you want to call them? Professor Black?
It might come as a surprise from my title being Professor of Marketing, but I see myself as a Professor of Sustainable Consumption. But I think marketing needs to be strongly restricted. I think if there was an additionality here, we have to learn the lessons from social marketing, from tobacco control, and to say that from environmental and social good, that the role here is to restrict marketing, to restrict those messages which are beautifully timed to know exactly where you're standing in order to put that really well-designed message in front of your nose so you can almost smell that coffee that comes through. And you know, the amount of knowledge that they have and how good they are at using it is scary. And it is only designed essentially to do one thing. It's to get you to buy more and more of their things. So I think, again, understanding the damage that consumption can do to the individual, with that might take you into debt, particularly now when we tap. Rather than have, maybe you still use money, but I've kind of almost got out of the habit of it. And one of the things we know about using electronic money is we go into debt more easily. So the more that so if it's on our phone, we get the message as we tap, there's individual harm. There's harm that then comes to the family for not having the money. That old thing of your grandmother getting to your grandfather before he went to the pub on a Friday night, which was part of my family history as coming from Clydebank. You know, we're seeing modern versions of that. So I think if there is a role for restricting marketing, restricting the invasion of messages to you, which of course we have ticked, but of course none of us have read and could read the terms and conditions, to the extent now that you do see a number of these emails just saying whatever as an excuse rather than yes or no. They know you're not going to read it, so they're going through in your mind whatever, and they'll jokingly put that one down. So I think that what I would see here very much for a role is trying to restrict marketing, to restrict the harms.
Graham?
Well, yes, I don't know about restricting, depends what you mean by restricting, but I think that we want to be careful not to be anti-technology, because that can lead to unfortunate consequences, I think. But the key thing here is, I think, to make sure that consumers understand what they're giving consent to, and to try and make sure that those systems work so that you get the marketing you want and not other marketing. And this, of course, is very difficult, it's also very difficult in terms of enforcement and resources for enforcing these sorts of things. But don't forget that certain messages, I think, are useful. For example, if you get a message that it's time you got your car serviced, otherwise you may have a real problem, that could be a useful message. And actually, I understand that these days, far beyond me, but cars can now transmit information individually to a dealer and tell the dealer to get in touch with you that your car needs a new whatever it may be, so that it doesn't stop on the motorway. And I mean, actually, I suppose that's useful information. But I think that in terms of marketing, as I say, I think it's very much for Consumer Scotland, coming back to the bill, for Consumer Scotland to try and identify and advise consumers as a whole, not individually, on exactly how to go about making sure that they don't get the marketing they don't want, and to try and ensure that they understand if they're giving away too much data unnecessarily. But it's certainly not an easy thing. And I mean, we could all sit and say, let's restrict marketing, fair enough, but that might be quite difficult in itself, I suspect. Or maybe not, you think. You just want to ban it, do you?
Mechanisms by which we could do that, but I'm not sure if we want me to go into them, fine, but maybe not.
Sheila, did you have your hand?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Graham has said, and I think it's definitely a challenge with digital markets these days to really get into the detail of what's happening. And I think the point about consumer advice, the role that Consumer Scotland can play in providing consumers with advice. We had a very specific recommendation to the Scottish Government about whether Consumer Scotland could play an important part in educating young people about how they interact with online services, and particularly because we think that although they're very good at the tech, they know what to do online, I don't think they necessarily always understand what their rights are and what their means of redress is if things go wrong. So we were quite keen that that was something particularly that we felt that in Scotland could be, Consumer Scotland could lead the way on. So we'd be very keen to see that being taken forward, but also just to say there's quite a lot of things going on at the UK and international level around digital markets, and we are currently undertaking a market study into digital platforms, and we will be looking at some of these issues in association with other partners like the Advertising Standards Authority, I think also play a part, and the ICO, Information Commissioner's Office, who are obviously responsible for data protection issues.
Consumers have a right, do they not, to not be contacted? There's a right within the GDPR to be forgotten. It doesn't seem to apply in a number of cases, despite your attempts to deregister from constant emails that you might get. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So has the consumer lost a kind of sense of being able to protect their own identity and their own privacy from this kind of model of marketing that's constantly bombarding us? And should that be improved? Does it need to be strengthened? And is there a role for Consumer Scotland in that as well?
I think it's very much an issue for the ICO. They're responsible for policing the GDPR. But I think there is a role for consumers as well, and it may be about making sure that they have the right sort of level of advice. I mean, generally, not this isn't universal, but generally people have a choice of where they go to buy goods and services. They don't need to stick with a supplier that may appear to be dominant or may appear to be the preferred supplier of others. It's possible to shop around, and we might encourage consumers to do that if they don't think that they're getting the service that they want, or getting pushed marketing that they don't want.
Okay. Professor Black.
I think there's issues of trust here in the organisations that we're dealing with, and I absolutely agree that there's a need to protect people's data, give them the opportunity to be forgotten, etc. But Facebook, for example, is entire capitalisation is based on being able to advertise to us. So whatever we put in place, they will try and then get round that by changing the settings and the updates, etc. So we have the information available to us, but it's buried, and it happens at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday when we've plugged our phone in, and it manages to get by us until we next find round. So I think waiting for the consumer to act, before government does anything is a model I wouldn't support 100%. I think there needs to be more inspection and inspection before it gets to the consumer. I'd also suggest that that we might think we have a lot of choice, but we have the choice that the market gives us. There's not a lot of difference between Asda, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, etc. When you look to see what's available they're essentially selling us the same products at around about the same sort of prices. And the institutions that have been constructed with government mean that it's not as easy to start up a fishmonger. It's not as easy to have a local fruit and veg shop. So we think we have choice within that. But the institutions of government and the economy have created the choices for us, and then we have a very limited level of media telling us very limited messages, and we think we have choice, and we have the choice to do as we're told.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you.
Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. The bill as currently drafted defines consumer as just the individual consumer. It doesn't cover small business, micro business or sole traders. Given the comprehensive nature of the legislation, do you think that is the right approach? Please.
Don't have a particularly strong view on this, but I do think that ourselves as an authority has considered small businesses and micro businesses when we've been conducting our market study work and our investigations into the energy and banking markets, particularly looked at micro businesses as consumers and made recommendations, specific remedies to address some of the issues they were facing, both in accessing finance and also accessing energy supply. So we would certainly advocate a fairly broad approach to this. I think my only question only really occurred to me when I was listening to the previous session, where this may potentially be something to think about, is around the consumer duty that might apply to public authorities and how easy it would be for public authorities to define consumers to include micro businesses in that context. But it's something to certainly bear in mind.
Yes, please.
Well, for the last 20 years, I've been involved in European legislation as well, through our European Trade Association, Eurocommerce, and this has come up a lot in that context. And each time, I think the general view has been that one should separate out B2B legislation from B2C, in part because the rights and obligations for a consumer and a business towards a consumer are often different and need to be different from those where you have freedom of contract actually between two businesses. Now, I understand why you raise the question, because obviously if you're a small business, you may not, freedom of contract can exist, but on the other hand, it may well be that the contract's relatively imposed upon you. But I think that if you think there are problems between small traders to small traders actually, and small traders to large traders and vice versa, they should be dealt with in their own right and in their own way, rather than trying to pretend that they are just like all consumers. They're similar, but I think you want to take into account certain other aspects that that are necessary. And if you, as I say, if you want to deal with B2B issues, that's fair enough. And certain things have gone through both here and else and at the European level in terms of food dealings and that sort of thing. But I think that it's best kept separate, or else you'll divert attention from one to the other and it becomes less. And it's interesting actually that most member states of the EU have kept them separate, not all of them.
James.
So I think from a simplistic way, it's the easiest way to do it. From a more complex situation, I will look at our world, and we get quite a significant number of small businesses that raise issues with their telecoms provider, their energy provider, through Resolver, and often they have the same level of recourse as they would do as a consumer. So I don't think it's a simple, they're fully out. In my world, there is actually areas where they have the same rights, and actually they have the same problems, which is, you know, we are 3 employees, we can't get broadband to work, and it's key to our business. Well, actually, they're being affected as much as a consumer is, and probably in some respects more, because they're being stopped from being able to trade, yet they have very limited powers sometimes to be able to try and deal with issues.
Sarah, yes.
I don't really have a particularly strong view on this either, but I do think it's something that needs to be bottomed out, and it is something that Consumer Focus did have powers in relation to business in certain circumstances, and I think the Extra Help Unit still does deal with vulnerable businesses who are facing disconnection. That was the main area I remember. I think it's difficult because in recent years that the lines have been blurred a bit between individuals and businesses. And, you know, I'm a sole trader in my consultancy, for example. You know, if I buy a computer, and, you know, am I a business or am I an individual? And I think it is something that needs to be thought about. I do wonder, you know, there are other organisations out there, of course, like Federation of Small Businesses, and you know, they may have a role in this, and it might be something that could be worked on together. I suppose my big concern would be that resources are taken away from actually focusing on individuals and collective consumer interests. But I do think it's something that needs to be explored, and I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. But I think probably you're talking about very small businesses. I think you would have to be very clear what that meant, and I think it would, for me, it would be you would have the power to do that rather than actually a duty to look after the interests of those small businesses, depending on what the other priorities were.
Thank you for that feedback. It's been an interesting area of questioning because we've received a lot of mixed feedback from different panel members and different witnesses on this point. I don't think anyone has a particularly strong view either way, but I mean, James, I thought your point about if you have a sole trader or an individual person running a business, in many ways their needs are the same. They don't have the B2B power of negotiation when they're looking at some of the real issues you've discussed about flight delays, parcel delivery, e-commerce issues. So I think in that context, and given that other legislation does extend to small business, and I think, Sheila, your point about it has to be very small, I think is the right point to make. Would there be, in terms of practical issues, do you think that would then mean a much higher resource would have to be in place to, if we covered the definition of consumer to small business, do you then see a step change in the resource required to enforce and provide the protections to small business?
Probably depends on the definition, i.e. not the definition of small business, because I think that can be quite easily bottomed out, but the definitions of where the landscapes that it covers. If it's the whole landscape, there probably is an increase in resource, but to me it does not sound like a significant increase. The main areas that a small business I see struggles from are issues with the same suppliers and the same issues that the consumer has. It is not they don't turn up to us anyway with an issue with a supplier or a trader. It's I can't get my mobile, I can't get my energy, I can't get my broadband, I can't get my service. And it is that service element which is the one that throttles what they're trying to achieve.
Sorry, just to come back on that, I think that it really depends what level the Consumer Scotland is going to operate at. If it's going to try and deal with the sorts of things he's dealing with, you know, a sale of goods and services issues, essentially, then I don't get the impression that's the role of, or going to be the role of Consumer Scotland, that I go to Consumer Scotland and say, as a small businessman, I can't get broadband, my mobile doesn't work. And there may be reasons why people have bought or the hairdryer's broken if I'm a small hairdresser, and actually I've bought something that's a consumer product and not a product to be used every day on 20, 30 people, then you've got the wrong thing. So that if it's a matter of advice to those sorts of people on what they should do, a bit like the Small Business Commissioner. I can't remember if he operates in Scotland, does he? But anyway, the sort of advice that you could give to small businesses in general of this is what you need to look out for and these are your rights as well and this is how you could go about sorting out your problems, that's one thing. If you're going to get down into the nitty-gritty of the specifics like you do and sorting out a specific problem for someone, then perhaps we need to look at it a bit differently and resources would come into it then a lot more.
Thank you.
The last panel touched on this, Graham Wynne, and this panel touched on this, and that's the definition of the vulnerable consumer. I think, and I paraphrase, yeah, just because you're 60 doesn't make you vulnerable, and therefore, do you think the definition is perhaps too narrow, and we need to include something about context? So can I go to Graham Wynne first?
Well, I just picked that out because being over 60, and I noticed in the bill that I'm apparently vulnerable. I often feel vulnerable, but I agree with the panellist, can't remember if it was this panel or the previous panel, who said that it's circumstances, really. I mean, when you take your car in for servicing, unless, well, especially these days where it's all done by computer, I think we're all vulnerable and have absolutely no idea whether the service has been done or not. Some people are vulnerable in relation to financial services, as people said. Well, actually probably young people even more than old, because old people are, counting their cash. But I think that, so I think it's very difficult to give a definition in terms of this person, that person, the other person. And it's, yes, well, we're just all vulnerable at various times, and I'm not quite sure how you define it other than to say it's people who have a lack of information and a lack of ability really to gather that information in relation to the product or the service they're buying, and therefore they can be vulnerable. But I think it's a bit difficult to just say, well, I happen to notice the over 60 thing, thought it was a bit ageist, but there are other things there. And it's a definition that I know the CMA has toyed with for quite some time. I don't know if you've ever come to a proper conclusion. Perhaps you have.
Yeah, James, first.
Thank you. What I was going to say is I think we'll probably all say the same thing, that vulnerability is situational. And the definition of the concept that you actually go one day and you suddenly become vulnerable is not realistic. We move in and out of vulnerability. We have taken all of the market definitions of vulnerability and created an algorithm, and we run at about 85% accuracy of being able to identify if somebody's vulnerable. And bizarrely enough, it is not a black and white scenario, it's a shade of grey. Because you can say, for example, I'm elderly and live in a rural situation, but then if you also then add on, for example, and my bus comes through once a day and it didn't turn up, then you've moved up that scale, and every increment is an increase towards how vulnerable you are. So I do not see, when building that algorithm, we started out with the concept of whether you are or not, and actually have ended up with a scale of moving up towards how vulnerable we think you are, but we can't simply go yes or no, because it's a changing set of circumstances.
I just agree with what everybody else has said I've heard so far. I think we're all more or less in the same place on this, so it's difficult to know what else I can say that can kind of add to your understanding. I mean, the only thing I was going to say, I think the other thing is, just there's something about defining it in legislation that sort of kind of fixes it for this time and in the present, and I think there's something about recognising that it's more dynamic than that, and if there are alternative ways of setting that as an agenda through the work programme or through some other mechanism, I think we would think that would be a better approach.
Context and flexibility is what I'm taking away from that. I'm assuming you think the same way, so forgive me, I'm going to move on.
There was a little point underneath
that. Well, I'm going to ask you the next question, so you can cover it in the next question. So the bill's going to create a consumer duty for public bodies. Is this something you support? Do you think it will make a difference? And I know, Professor Black, you have a distinctive view, so let me start with you.
Thank you very much. No, I think we'd see this as quite dangerous, or potentially dangerous. The notion of bringing consumerism into public life was an idea brought by an author called Philip Kotler, who literally wrote the textbook about marketing. He's made multiple millions of dollars over multiple iterations. And within 2 years of him writing this, he backed away from the idea that patients are consumers or students are consumers, to say, no, there are power and agency differences there. In my own sector, within higher education, we now have the National Student Satisfaction Survey, of where essentially chancellors and vice chancellors have become extremely focused on the notion of, has our NSS score gone up? And in particular, has our student satisfaction, overall satisfaction score gone up? If it has done, then we've done a good job as a university, which has meant that we've just shifted on trying to make the students happy. Instead of putting together the things that actually look at from a pedagogical perspective, what do we need them to engage with their studies and think, we've got them to see, can we make life easier for you and nicer for you around this thing. So I think there's a fundamental issue there. I also think there's a danger if we take that into there. It might be a route that you want to go, that this provides a market solution to where market solutions are not best available. So if you're trying to privatise a public service, the first thing that's kind of well known that you do is you defund it, get people to get angry about the quality. The second thing that you essentially do with it is try to bring in a privatisation frame, bring in a market frame. So if you call people consumers in the health service, all of a sudden they're thinking individually, they have their expectations, and then when you say we have a solution to this and it's private sector, you've set them up nicely to accept the privatisation. So I think that might be the role, might be the direction that we're going. I would suspect not. So therefore, I think bringing that frame into public sector has potential dangers.
Anybody else on the panel? Sarah?
Well, I take your point. I do have a different view. As I said before, that this was a big area of work for Scottish Consumer Council and Consumer Focus. A lot of the work was on public services, on, for example, parental engagement in education, patient involvement in decision making, those kind of issues. And that's where I see this is coming from. And I see that as very positive that public bodies are having to think about these things. You know, whether you want to use the term consumer or not, that they're thinking about the impact that it has on their users who don't buy the services but who are using the services, who are very vulnerable in some cases. If we want to go back to vulnerable, say social care services, for example, about actually engaging people in decision making and thinking about how policies might impact from the very beginning. I think that's a very positive thing. I'm not quite sure what it means by public bodies. Does this include, for example, Scottish Government when it's producing legislation on a variety of issues which might not be about public services? Does the Scottish Government need to think about this when it's implementing Consumer Scotland Bill, for example? It's those kind of issues. And I also wonder, it's very difficult clearly to apply this to private bodies, because that would be a very difficult thing in terms of legislative competence. But one of the things that I had thought about was whether it might also be extended to private bodies which are providing public services, as we have under freedom of information legislation, for example, and whether that's something that should be considered, private bodies providing social care services, prisons, those kind of things as well, that's something that might be within legislative competence. But certainly I see it's been very positive, and Consumer Scotland clearly would have a very important role in this, in providing guidance to bodies and working with them, and that's something that consumer bodies have done in the past, working with SPSO and others to try to improve things for consumers of public services.
Any other views?
Yes, no, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Sarah said there. I mean, I think quite a lot of the work that we do as an authority, well, although our focus at the moment is very much on competition, as Graham mentioned, there are some reform proposals that our chairman has put to government that would expand our remit so that we would be more focused on looking at the impact of activity on consumers. And I think that focus on the consumer rather than just competition is an interesting way forward. And I think, so we broadly welcome that focus in the Consumer Scotland Bill. I think, as Sarah's mentioned, that, the devil's in the detail. Really, it would be interesting to see who it applies to. And I think, it would be fair, I think, for it to apply to a broad range of players who are providing those sorts of public services, as she suggested.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Right. Thank you very much, Chair Panel. I'm afraid we're out of time now, so thank you very much for coming in today. I'll suspend the meeting. We'll move into private session.